Hey everybody, Rob Childs here, fresh off of the event known as Combat Con. This takes place in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I can tell you that I had a great time. If you've never been to it, I suggest that you go to this at least once. It can be a little on the pricey side, both in terms of the lodging and in particular the food, but the event itself is well worth going because there was lots of fencing to be done. There were pickup fights, and of course, there were all kinds of fencing tournaments that you could participate in. There was saber, there was longsword, there was rapier, there were cutting tournaments. If you didn't get enough fencing over the course of that event, then it's just because you weren't trying. Now, in particular, obviously I, as a rapier guy, participated in the rapier tournament, and I had the good fortune and skill in order to fight my way through the semifinals, into the finals, into the gold medal match. And that is what I want to talk to you, my Patreon supporters, about, because as a part of your support, you get access to exclusive videos, and this one in particular I want to talk to you about because my opponent in the gold medal match made a classic mistake that I have seen people make all over the world, and today I want to talk to you about that. So I'm going to show you that gold medal match at full speed as well as in slow motion, utilizing that footage to show you what it was that my opponent did that cost him the match.
Judges, are you ready? Fencers, are you ready? Fence! One hold!
If you are a student of mine, then you've already heard me talk about the concept of in-between time many times. It is something that I catch on my opponents many times. The concept of in-between time basically just describes how every single person, at the end of every action that they do, there is a slight pause. It's only a fraction of a second long. But as I have also told my students, fencing itself is measured in fractions of a second. If you pause at the end of every action that you're doing, you establish that pattern for my eyes to discern, then I am going to use that against you, as any opponent should, by launching my attacks at the end of every one of those actions. Now, if you were paying attention to that last, or I should say the first exchange that we just did, that last clip, you will notice that my opponent was constantly shifting the guard of his swords. He was constantly moving forward and back. He was shifting left and right. It was all extraneous movement that had no purpose. Now, that alone is enough to lower your defenses. But even worse, it is deadly when you establish a pattern that your opponent can pick up. Now, in that particular exchange, all I did was, if you're watching closely, I backed off, he backed off, and I stepped forward right when I saw when he was about to take his step. Now, because of the fact that I knew that he was going to have that pause at the end, I launched right when his foot came down, and straight to the head I went.
Fence! One hold!
In that exchange, I actually had to hit my opponent twice. You probably saw as I struck my opponent the first time, I backed off waiting for the judges to make their calls, but unfortunately it slipped right past them. And that is one of the perils of being a rapier swordsman. Is sometimes, and it's not the first time, the action happens so quickly that the judges completely miss it. Literally, if you blink, the action can be over and done. I don't hold that against them. It happens and you just kind of work with it. During that second exchange in that particular clip, you'll notice that my opponent was shifting. It was getting worse, that problem I had mentioned about the extraneous movement. He was shifting left and right, even bigger motions, forward and back, switching from one guard stance into another stance, pointing his sword to the sky and then holding it crossed horizontal across his body. A constant, rapid transition of motion is going to establish the pattern. Now, in that particular instance, I only took advantage of the fact that when he finally went for a big cut, I went straight up the middle into a thrust. And as everybody knows who has been fencing even a year under their belt, the thrust is always faster than the cut. So in that particular instance, I launched into the thrust, parried with my dagger. He did manage to smack the dagger and clip the helmet anyway, so he was able to score the afterblow. But in a martial contest, what do you think would have happened? As he is going into the middle of his cut and my thrust hits him in the face, what do you think happens to all action after that point? Well, if you're a student of mine, we have already discussed this. Fencing from a martial perspective, anytime that you hit and move the head of your opponent, everything else melts away. It doesn't matter whether or not the sword actually penetrated the skull. If you jar the head and you move the head, the body must follow, and everything else that the opponent had planned or wanted to do goes away. Now, in the context of a fencing competition, obviously that is not the case, but in this particular instance, you can see he goes into a long motion, I go into the short motion, my motion lands well ahead of his, and you see the results play out as they did.
Black thrust ahead, that's not one. Black thrust ahead with afterblow.
Fence!
By now, you're probably starting to pick up a pattern of your own. As you noticed, if you watched in particular during the slow motion portion of that clip, my opponent was taking a step forward, and notice when I launched into my attack. It's right as his foot is coming down, because at that moment, he is caught with the concept of in-between time. He is frozen for that split second, making it very easy for my laser straight thrust going straight up the middle. He didn't have a chance. He was frozen, and that ended the match.
Thrust ahead!
Black thrust ahead, match black.
Match black.
So for all of you fencers out there who are supporting the Patreon channel, I want to make sure that you are understanding that there are actually two key concepts to take away from this video. In my book, I talk about medal matches and the mistake that I see made around the world of fencers who they fence one way that leads them all the way up through the medal matches, and then as soon as they get to those finals, as soon as they get to the part where they are fighting for the bronze medal, they're fighting for that gold medal, the pressure gets to them and they change the way they fence. That is the first mistake right there. If you have been fencing a certain way and it has carried you through the day in order to get to where you are at that point, why would you ever change at that point? Don't let the pressure of the tournament force you into something that you are not familiar with. Don't change at that moment. Don't think about what's coming in the future. Don't think about getting to through the bronze match and getting into the gold medal match. Fence the way that has brought you to where you are. It is the skills that you have honed and worked on for yourself, and clearly they are good enough to carry you into the medal matches. Don't change what you're doing just because the pressure is on and you're in those final medal matches. And lastly, don't commit to a bunch of extraneous extra actions that have absolutely no purpose. If what you're doing serves no purpose other than to just give you a flurry of movement, well, rest assured, that is actually a bigger flaw than you know. Against an opponent who is experienced, a person who's going to be able to see and discern those patterns in the way you move, that is deadly. So make sure that when you are fencing, everything you do has a purpose. If you are uncomfortable with the situation that you are in, back away, get out of range, reassess, and then go back in when you have a plan about what you want to do. Trust me, it is going to serve you well in the long run, but the extraneous motions, the changing of the way that you fence in those medal matches, letting the pressure get to you, I have seen so many fencers fail when really they probably would have won. So I hope you found this video useful. If you guys have any questions, by all means, as Patreon supporters, you guys have my first priority when it comes to answering those questions. So reach out to me on Facebook. You can reach out to me on the Patreon channel itself. I am more than happy to help you guys out wherever I can, in particular you fencers out there. In the interim, train hard, keep fighting, and hopefully I'll see you at a competition sometime soon.